great to have this distinguished panel here. We have David Curtis, historian and film curator, who is the only one of us on the panel who was actually at Exprmntal at the 4th in 1967, 68. And of course we're very happy to have your film, but congratulations, as I said, on such an accessible film. And since we haven't, most of us in the audience, although there are a couple of people in this audience who have been, but for a lot of us, you know, who've just read about it, seen the odd image, to have that archival footage is really fantastic and such a gift. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
And Xavier Garcia Bardon has been writing a history of this festival for a decade, I think, which is a reasonable length of time, and you know, for such an enormous project. So a lot of expertise here to talk about. But we have to start with you and your film. And really, I'm quite interested to hear just you say a little bit about the kind of mix of ambition and circumstance that gave it the structure and the form that it does. Because you told us that a producer said to you that this would be a great thing for a film, and you thought, okay, and researched it, but then of course it had to take shape in a particular way.
Yeah, it's well, it's a very relatively obscure thing unless you speak to experimental filmmakers or you look into the history books of experimental cinema. So the first thing I did, of course, was to go to the Cinematheque, who has an outrageous amount of letters and programs from back in the day. And then you start researching that, you start looking at the movies, you start going to the national broadcasters to see if they have any material which they shot at the festivals. And then you have indeed this huge pile of material which is completely different. Everything's different. You have black and white, you have color, you have 4:3 ratio, you have cinemascope ratios, and then you have to start shaping it into this structured, coherent thing, I hope. So I had, of course, I had a very good editor also who helped a lot with doing that, but it was really a work of, a labor of love for 16 weeks of editing and seeing how everything could fit together in this way.
And you had to track people down, so you had to find people who were there, who could talk about it, and I think you tried to track this guy down, and I think a few others.
True. We tried to get, we were in touch with David on a few occasions, but we didn't manage to set up a place and a time to actually do the interview, so, but I'm happy to meet him tonight. And of course, some people are relatively easy to find, and since Xavier is also working as a curator, he also told me on several occasions, hey, we're inviting Jonas Meekes in Brussels, maybe, you know, it's the right opportunity to interview him. And other people were impossible to track down, like BOZAR. I sent him a letter, he never replied. Scorsese, Polanski, I mean, it's impossible to...
Can't happen.
No.
Okay, maybe we can hear from you. You are the only person on this panel who was there in 67, 68. And it was an interesting time for you. You were programming at the Arts Lab at that time. And we're just really interested to hear about the impact of that festival, not just on you personally, but on seeing back in London the filmmakers co-op as it's evolving, and what you really see is the impact of that film festival.
Well, I think in a way the festival changed the course of my life. I mean, it was an incredibly important thing for me. I'm slightly ashamed when watching your film that it wasn't because of the kind of protests about Vietnam, and it wasn't about American capitalism or anything else. It was because it was an extraordinary moment at which particularly the American avant-garde, but also the emerging European avant-garde, was all laid out in front of one over, I can't remember, a week perhaps, 10 screenings a day, something like that.
Morning till midnight.
Morning till midnight, and I have to say that in London there was very little happening at that time. I was somebody who was already really interested in experimental film. I had been going to Bob Cobbing's screenings at Better Books, which was where the London Film Co-op was founded in '66. So I'd seen one or two experimental films. I think there were a couple of Kurt Kren films in circulation in London. James Whitney, there were a couple of films by him. There was a couple of very early Brackage films in distribution through Connoisseur Films. So that was our kind of international perspective. The British perspective, there was Jeff Keane working in Brighton, being very productive and showing at the Filmmakers Co-op. He wasn't, sadly, at Knuckle Zoot. I don't know whether he didn't know. Margaret Tate was working up in Orkney and Edinburgh. Hadn't shown any films south of the border yet, so we didn't know about her. Malcolm Grice had just made his first film, Castle One, which he showed at the Arts Lab in October of '67, and so I was able to kind of go to Knocker knowing that Malcolm had made this film, and I was able to talk to Birgit Hein, who I met there, and said, actually, Birgit, there's somebody in London making films very like yours, you know. But that, you know, Malcolm wasn't at the festival, and he was just starting out. Peter Giddell might have been in London, he hadn't started showing yet. Don Levy, who was at Knocker with his film Herostratus out of competition, he was making films. That was pretty much it. So going to Knocker Zoot and seeing work by Paul Sharits, there was a complete Gregory Markopoulos retrospective. I met Werner Neckers, people like that. It was a complete eye-opener. You tell me that Mike Snow wasn't there, but I certainly encountered his film there, and I thought I kind of knew him. Joyce Whelan, ditto, her films were there. You know, it was an extraordinary, eye-opening exposure to American and European work. I certainly came back to London thinking, you know, this is amazing. I had an address book full of addresses, so at the Arts Lab I was able to say to people like Rob Breer, Stan van der Beek, who I'd met there, I can't remember who the other ones were, but they all came and showed in London during the next few months, not even years. I'd met P. Adam Sidney there, and P. Adam Sidney was touring Europe at the time with a huge collection of new American cinema. And Simon Hartog, who was a member of the Filmmakers Co-op here in London, who was also at Knocker, he and I arranged with Sidney that Sidney would come. He'd show here, I think in April '68, and then we organized a tour around 12 universities in Britain with the new American cinema program, including things like Jack Smith's Flaming Creatures and so on. So that, in a way, the richness of American work and the richness of European work began to be visible in London. And by 1970, I was kind of fired up enough with a few others to think we should do our own festival. We were a bit critical of Knuckle Zoot. It had been a competitive festival. We didn't like the idea of competitions. It was sponsored by Ag for Gavers, and you had to make your film on their stock if you received money. We didn't like that aspect and so on. So we did what we thought was a much more democratic festival here at the NFT in 1970, to which we invited everybody just to show what they wanted to show. It was not competition and so on. So in a way, I think that was all a catalyst to things that happened later on.
And Xavier, you are dealing with the entirety of the festival, is that right? That you
I'm trying to.
So
it's not easy.
The whole shebang. And you know, I wanted to ask you in terms of, rather than ask you what is the kind of important things for you about this festival, which is just so enormous, I wonder actually if I could ask you, what are things about it that you think people don't know about, including experimental film people, people who are involved in this? You know, why do we need this history? Like, what will it reveal to us that we think we know it, and we have stories, and we know it from David and from others, and the filmmakers' accounts of it, but what do we need this history for?
Good question. I think think David started answering it already, but I think we need to understand to which extent actually this festival, which was the first one, as Brecht says it, to which extent the festival helped mapping what was happening, who was doing what and where, and connect all those dots. And that was super important, yeah. I'm not surprised to hear that you met Birgit Hein, and you met Pierre in Sydney, you met all those people there. And before the festival, nobody, I mean, those people were actually working, each one was working in his room, and they met there. Internationally, but also nationally. I mean, Birgit Hein told me that she had no idea that other people in Germany were doing stuff. So that's one thing. And then I would say that it was not only about cinema. Actually, there was also music. There were exhibitions. There were a lot of unexpected things also, and that makes it a very interesting event, like totally unique, I think, in the cultural history. Yeah.
And actually, the predominance of performance, music performance, all kinds of performance that was there. And historically, it's also positioning experimental film in the context of what's going on in the other arts.
Yes,
and so all of the ideas around composition and kind of method.
Just one example, but in 1967, Harald Zeeman, almost the person who invented the position of the curator, he visited Exprmntal 4 just as a visitor, and he was deeply influenced actually by the way the festival put together cinema in connection with the other arts, and was open to the unforeseen, and that really influenced him. And he wrote that to Ledoux, that it influenced him when he put together the Documenta 5, 1972 anyway. Yeah, because that way of putting together cinema and the other arts was kind of that came before Documenta, Exprmntal maybe before.
Yeah, and still I think in terms of history, we're still only now doing more of that.
Yes, totally.
You know, thinking about film in relation to the other arts.
Yeah, the festival kind of pioneered that.
And taking it seriously. Yeah.
And it's interesting because it came from the cinema side, not from the art side.
Yeah.
Just to jump in there, I've only recently started looking at was it Prospect, the 70, 71, whatever, the big film and photo kind of avant-garde festival in Stuttgart, was it? I can't remember.
Düsseldorf, I think.
Düsseldorf, yeah, more likely Düsseldorf. I mean, it was interesting that I think almost nobody from London went to that. We didn't know about that. This is just bearing out your suggestion that these are divergent paths in a way at that time, and bringing them together was something interesting that Ledoux was trying to do, which we threw away completely in 70. We were film only, and very clear that we were doing artists' films, not kind of calling card short experimental films.
On the other hand, I have to add that Ledoux felt quite uncomfortable with artist films.
As an idea.
I mean, there were many few artist films in the programs. They were mostly coming from the cinema side, experimental films. That is for sure. Even if there were exhibitions and performances, it's interesting to know that Marcel Brotar's film Le Corbeau et Renard was actually rejected because it was supposed to be screened on a prepared screen, a special screen that had some writings on it. So the expanded cinema piece were problematic, and the artists' films were also. So there were limits.
And Brecht, you were about to say something?
No, I was thinking of something that Roland Letem, who is also in the movie, said to me the first time I met, that because of this collection of arts all being combined in Knokke, that the festival itself became like an artwork in itself. He really saw it as kind of a Gesamtkunstwerk, say, and then it's also what Ledoux said. You have the foreseen, the film events, you have the site programs, and that together creates this situation out of which the unforeseen things happen, like the fact that the movie was there, that was a foreseen event, but that people would start taking their clothes off and start dancing inside, that was not really on the program. So,
and the fact that German students would start protesting against the festival, that was also totally unexpected, yeah.
Yeah, all those unplanned events, but at the same time having the kind of space